this particular class, besides being a class you must take to graduate with an IFI degree, okay, is a really important stepping stone to pretty much any type of health-related field or even human research-related field, okay? So what is it exactly that you're going to study and you're going to learn? So first of all, part of our class, right, contains the word human in it. And that is studying the specific organism that is the human being, right? And what is it that we're going to study about that human being? Well, it's its physiology, but I wonder how many of us have really stopped to think about what the term physiology means. Physio, the prefix here, comes from origin or nature, and the second part comes from study of or logia. So basically, when we put these pieces together, what we're doing is studying the nature, right? The process of the human being. And within that, what we're going to do is talk a lot about how different systems work. Now, one thing that we have to remember is that there's several different levels of hierarchy in which you can discuss this particular concept, right? We could talk at the molecular level, at the cellular level, at the tissue level, all the way up to the entire organism, right? And we actually are going to do that quite a bit throughout the entire semester. When we get into digestion here in a moment, we're going to be discussing specific cells and how on a chemical level they do what they're supposed to do, right? And then when we take a step back and think about that one cell, for example, in the stomach, we can understand why the stomach does what the stomach is supposed to do, okay? So we're going to transcend several different layers. Another thing to remember, and this is also extraordinarily important, especially when we start getting into things like cardiovascular physiology, is that human physiology, and actually all physiology in general, is what we call integrated, right? Integrated physiology just means that no one system functions completely independent of another, right? So when there are problems in one system, it will cause big problems in another, right? Or it has the potential to cause big problems in another. And so there's lots of things that are dependent on one another and affect overall function as we cross several systems. This diagram does a nice job of kind of showing us how that actually plays itself out, where you can see everything that's part of kind of the external environment or continuous with it is going to add things to your blood or take things from your blood. And so you'll see things like the digestive system, respiratory system, urinary system, and how all of these kind of feed in together. There is a component missing from that diagram. Can anybody tell me what it is? There's a system missing. Lymphatic, which would lend itself to kind of what function? Immune, right? So immune system's missing. That also is extremely important because we know that the immune system is contained within a lot of these different areas and also has huge consequences on whether or not everything functions how it's supposed to in terms of catching things like tumor cells, pathogens, etc. One branch of physiology, or I should say a more specific study of physiology, is something called pathophysiology. Pathophysiology actually is a requirement for most nursing schools, just FYI if you guys don't know this yet. And it's the study of disease. It's the study of disease process and what goes wrong in a system to then cause something like, let's say, congestive heart failure or atherosclerosis or diabetes. Pathophys is, so this is going to be a completely shameless plug, offered in the Maymester, okay, by Dr. Shi, who coordinates the phys labs, but is offered by me in the fall. And that particular class, this last semester, it was actually brand new this last fall. I only had 15, so it was a small seminar class, and I'd like to keep it that way, although I doubt it'll stay that way. It's only offered in the fall, so if you're graduating now in May, I apologize, but I strongly recommend. We do a lot of case studies in there, and it's a lot about disease. You guys will look at x-rays and blood work and echocardiograms and all kinds of stuff to just understand what's going on with that class, or with that person. So if you guys are interested, let me know. It is being offered in the fall regardless, but I'd love to see some of you again, because then you get to put a lot of what you're learning in here what you learned in Phys 1 to work by looking at different patients and case studies. Okay, you should have learned in Phys 1 the difference between teleological and mechanistic. And the reason these two things are important is because there's different ways in which you can answer a physiological question, okay? The teleological approach to both asking and answering a question is going to be the basic why answer, okay, or the basic why explanation. And so a teleological answer typically is more simple. The contrast to teleological is mechanistic. Mechanistic answers are more of a how does a process take place, okay? How does something happen? And as you'll see shortly here, those two questions and their relative answers can be drastically different. Typically speaking, a mechanistic answer, if it's a complete mechanistic, I was like, what in the world? If it's a complete mechanistic answer, can be long, can be very detailed, okay? Usually steps. Now, one thing to remember is that when a mechanistic answer is being given, you could just have one part of the steps and it's still considered mechanistic, okay? It's all about the wording and how the language is put together. So, as an example, we could ask, why do we breathe? Now, why do we breathe from a teleological perspective would be something like, because we need oxygen. It's pretty straightforward, right? That's one. Or because we need to get rid of CO2. That's another, right? It's just telling me why we do that particular process. But if I were to change that question to how do we breathe, now the answer has to be different. Because I'm not asking you why we do it. I'm asking you, how does the body create the ability to move air from out here into the lungs, right? And so you'd be talking about things like diaphragm contraction, pressure changes, pressure creating flow, and all of these other things, which, of course, you're going to learn throughout the semester. The mechanistic approach, again, tends to be much more detailed, but it is very precise in what it is discussing. And what you guys want to do throughout the semester here is become proficient in both of these, right? You want to become experts at both the level of detail, so the more mechanistic, as well as the kind of global, more teleological. Because sometimes we hone in so much on details that it's hard to take a step back and even remember why this is happening in the first place. And we want to make sure that we don't do that, right? We don't want to take a step back and go, you know, I could name every single enzyme and every single intermediate of glycolysis, but I don't even know why we do it. We don't want to do that, right? We want to make sure, now we're not going to do glycolysis, but I'm just an example. I just want to give you guys an idea of why we want to become experts in both of these. Okay, so a little bit of practice for you. Okay, so for this first one, we want to know which of the following is a teleological answer for the following. Why do the lungs expand during inspiration? Of motility, or should I say all types of motility, are carried out by muscle. Two muscle types will carry out our motility abilities, which is smooth and skeletal. Okay? Now, these muscles that help to carry out motility can be affected by neurotransmitters as well as hormones, okay? And mechanics, so like stretching and pulling, okay? Of these two muscle groups that can respond to hormones as well as the stretching mechanisms and the mechanics is smooth muscle. Skeletal muscle really only receives information and command from neurotransmitter. But when it comes to smooth muscle, for example, distension of the stomach or stretching of the stomach will activate the release of hormones that tell the stomach it needs to contract, okay? That is what can happen at the level of smooth. Now, what types of motilities do we have and how does this work? In terms of smooth muscle, the digestive system is primarily made up of what we call the single unit smooth muscle. Who remembers what that is and how it works? You should have learned this hopefully in Phys 1. If not, don't worry. I can define it quickly. But if anybody knows, I want to hear from you. Okay, so then I'm going to go ahead and tell you. Single unit smooth muscle means that when one smooth muscle cell becomes depolarized because of the gap junctions, all of the neighboring ones become depolarized as well, almost instantaneously, in such a way that the group of muscle cells in that area will work all at once together. So they'll all squeeze at the same time, or they'll all relax at the same time, okay? And that's important in terms of smooth muscle contractions in the gut, because if we had one smooth muscle contract by itself and then another one contract by itself, there's no functional movement as one single piece. And so food's not going to move forward. It's not going to be propelled like it's supposed to. Instead, we're just going to kind of get all these random contractions, and that's not going to be effective for what we want, okay? So the gap junctions help us to complete that type of functionality with very fast electrical information moving throughout. Another thing that is interesting about these particular cells is that they have what we call a spontaneous depolarization. Spontaneous depolarization basically means that the individual muscle fibers can depolarize without any kind of stimulus. So there's no hormone, neurotransmitter, stretch, nothing like that. They just kind of randomly depolarize. Now, if you look at this graph, okay, the spontaneous depolarization is indicated by what we call a slow wave potential. And what you'll notice is that the slow wave potential is beneath threshold. If we look at the muscle force generation, you'll see that there is none, okay? That should make sense. If we don't reach threshold, you cannot contract because you don't complete the necessary steps to activate the cascade that leads to contraction. So then it begs the question, well, why do we even have slow wave potentials if they don't create contractile force? I mean, it seems like we really only want contractile force here, so what's the point of this system? And it's thought that the point of this system is to ensure that when we do have hormone or neurotransmitter release, we guarantee that we're going to reach threshold, okay? So let me explain why. When a hormone is released or a neurotransmitter is released, it's going to add on top of the slow wave potential, which is then going to definitely push us over that threshold in a form of summation, giving us this action potential, which then will generate the contraction. Okay, so let's say in theory that we are missing one or the other. If we're missing slow wave potentials, we won't be able to reach threshold even with some of these hormone releases, at least not on a lower level. Okay, so if we release just a little bit of hormone or just a little bit of neurotransmitter, we might not get to threshold, so that communication won't lend itself to contractions like we would expect. On the flip side, with the slow wave potentials present, but if we're missing hormones or neurotransmitters, as you can see, the slow wave potentials aren't enough to get us there either. So the idea here is that these two things need to work together to ensure that we're able to get what we need. Now, what do you think is different, other than frequency, which is the obvious answer just by looking at the graph, but let's say in terms of body function, what would be different between this and then these over here? You'll notice that you get stronger forces of contraction because of higher frequency, but what must be changing that's allowing that to happen? Of what exactly? So frequency of action potentials, perhaps, coming from the autonomic nervous system, meaning we have more neurotransmitter, so you're going to get a bigger effect like that, right? And that just becomes modulation at the level of the brain, depending on what we've got going on for digestion. These slow wave potentials are initiated by a cell type, which actually is listed here, called the interstitial cells of Cajal. That term Cajal, it's just the last name of the scientist that discovered these. So these are scattered kind of throughout, and they are what dictate these slow wave potentials that then the cells around them follow because of the gap junctions, okay? Not every section of the digestive system is set to the exact same amount of contractions. So throughout the digestive system, we can vary anywhere from 3 contractions per minute all the way up to 12, okay? And that can be modified whether the digestive system's empty or whether you just ate a meal, okay? Your slowest contraction cycles are in the stomach. And that's because the stomach's primary purpose is to function like a grinder. So it kind of really smashes down on food and kind of holds that and then releases to kind of really pulverize the food down into a paste. When we move to the small intestine, that frequency gets faster. And that's because the small intestine serves a slightly different purpose. It is meant to mix, kind of like when you grab a bottle of dressing and you shake it up. That's one thing that the small intestine is intended to do. And then the other is to scoot things along, right? Move them along the small intestine, through the large, and then eventually out. When we talk about reaching threshold, we do understand that if we don't, there's no contraction. If we do, action potential and contraction. Contractions can vary in strength for smooth muscle, depending on overall calcium concentrations. And that's mostly modulated by neurotransmitter release or hormone release. So the more neurotransmitters, the more receptors you activate, the more calcium you're going to be able to get. Same thing goes for hormone types of interactions. And again, all of that gets controlled either at the level of the brain or at the level of the gut itself within its nervous system. We're going to define essentially 3 major types of motility that are taking place, okay? The first one is something called the migrating motor complex. The migrating motor complex is a contraction that originates all the way up at the top of the stomach, and one big wave travels the rest of the way to the end, to the large intestine, okay? This happens every 75 to 90 minutes roughly, regardless of whether or not you've eaten. So this is not mandated by food. Okay, this is an intrinsic pattern of contraction that will take place on a cycle, originating up at the stomach. Think of one big ripple in a pond all the way through to the large intestine. Now that particular migrating motor complex has a couple of different purposes. One is that it's a housekeeper, okay? Housekeeping in the sense that it helps to kind of push undigested products towards the end, things like the cellulose that you can't digest, what we call the roughage of the intestines. And so that is one thing that it does. Those indigestible products, you don't really want them building up in places, so you kind of want to scoot that stuff out. The other thing that it does is prevent bacteria from migrating to places where they don't belong, okay? And you have bacteria that live with you in several different parts of your body in a helpful way, right? You have bacteria on your skin that help to control fungal growth and that kind of stuff, so you don't get fungal infections on your skin because of that. You have bacteria that live in your mouth, okay? And you have bacteria that live in the intestinal tract, particularly your large intestine. So the migrating motor complex makes sure that those bacteria that reside in the large intestine stay in the large intestine, as opposed to proliferating, growing, and migrating into the small intestine, where it doesn't seem like it should be a problem, but it would cause big issues with how the digestive system works appropriately. So this migrating motor complex, aside from the anatomical structures like the ileocecal valve and stuff like that, makes sure that everything stays where it's supposed to be, okay? You don't feel this, right? But it happens again every 75 to 90 minutes. You also don't really feel digestion either, although there's a whole lot of contraction going on to mix things and get things moving. Okay. The next type of contraction that we're going to define is what we call the tonic contractions. The term tonic is essentially sustained, always present. So this means that these are muscles that are always in a contracted state, right? These are going to be present only in what we call the sphincters. So your pyloric sphincter, your cardiac sphincter, the ileocecal valve would fall into that category as well. Internal anal sphincter, external anal sphincter, those are considered tonic contractions, because unless a stimulus is received, those muscles will stay contracted all the time, okay? Their purpose is to modulate movement of things into new compartments. And so when you swallow, right, what's going to happen at the very top of the cardiac sphincter is there's pressure coming in from the esophagus and the food that's sitting on top of it. That pressure causes nervous stimulation to relax the muscle. Muscle relaxes, food enters into the stomach, right? They depend on stimuli to get them to relax. Sometimes they'll fail a little bit, which causes backflow of food or backflow of solutions and secretions into places. And there's different things that might cause them to fail. And again, we'll talk a little bit about what some of those might be. Unless your body initiates the vomiting reflex, right? This is also to prevent the bolus, the actual food that you're digesting, from going backwards. And that again is important because the stomach is grinding and churning like crazy. You don't really want it to come back up, although it can, just because of failure of that sphincter, right? So everybody's had heartburn or acid reflux at some point in your life. That's because that particular sphincter hasn't closed all the way. Could be lots of different reasons why, okay? The vomiting reflex, though, is a kind of a remarkable thing because it causes everything to work in reverse, right? And so things will actually come up. And that's because muscles are working in reverse. The sphincters relax because something's pushing on the back end, and it causes that to come up and out. Otherwise, that shouldn't happen. The last type of motility type or movement type is what we call phasic. Now, when you think of the term phasic, what you should envision is it comes and goes, right? So I get contraction, relaxation, and it alternates between that in a pattern, okay? So there are two types of phasic contractions, and every time the muscle contracts, it only lasts a few seconds. So it's not a sustained long term, right? It's just a couple seconds and then it's going to relax. The two types are peristalsis and segmentation, okay? Peristalsis is when, if you envision a tube, right, like your small intestine, so you contract over here and then your bolus moves, and then you kind of scoot over and contract again and the bolus keeps moving, and you're doing forward motion, okay? The other one is segmentation, and segmentation should be thought of as mixing, okay? So you're mixing around foods and digestive juices and all kinds of stuff. And so now imagine the same tube, right? And so now you're going to contract over here, food's going to slosh this way, and then you're going to contract over here, and it's going to slosh back that way. And so then you kind of keep doing one of these things, which just moves it all back and forth, similar to shaking up a bottle, okay? So both segmentation and peristalsis are going to function off of that phasic type of contraction. Now, the rate at which this happens and how it happens, again, will be determined by hormone interaction, neurotransmitter interaction, other types of things like food presence, stretching, and that kind of stuff. Okay, good. So, thinking about all of this motility and its overall function, I want you guys to think about and predict for me what might happen if this didn't quite work the way we expect. So,